Well, the backdrop of this election will be the economy. But I think as we look at this election years from now, we'll see that there are actually broader issues involved. The nation's prosperity will always be centered in its politics. We live in a political economy. But I think what is also at stake here is what kind of nation shall we be? Because as I look at the two parties now as they stand, I see one party that's looking to forge ahead, and I see another party that, quite frankly, is looking to go back to a time that I don't particularly want to go back to. So it is about the economy, but it is also about the kind of nation we shall be. Who shall be accepted as fully human? Who shall be deemed as valuable to participate in the political economy? I see things, for example, when you look at the voter ID laws, they are designed to try to stop people from voting, or at least to make it as difficult as possible for people to vote and hope that they will be cynical about the process and stay home. So that in of itself affects a person's personal prosperity, but it will also affect the nation's common prosperity. So I think the election that's coming up in 2012 is both about the economy, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, so to speak, but also the kind of nation that we shall be. I think it's hard to make a claim that the economy is worse than what it was 3 years ago. If you're judging it from the perspective of 3 years ago, we were losing 300,000 jobs per year, and now we're making 150,000 to 200,000 jobs per month, rather, or that the economy had contracted by 8-9%, and now the economy is growing. So I think it's hard to make the claim that the economy is worse by an objective standard. If you want to make the case that the economy could be growing faster, that's a case you can make. But it would be very difficult to say that the economy is worse now than what it was. People forget unemployment went to 10% under Ronald Reagan in his first administration, and then it began to come down. So it's hard. One has to look at where we were in order to gauge where we are. You cannot simply say that we don't like where things are now if you think about 3 years ago where we were. The other thing is, as people like to say, well, let's forget about the past. You can't forget about the past because you don't want to do the things that got you into trouble before. You don't want to do those again. So you need to remember what was it that got you into the crisis you were in so that we can avoid that. And those who are talking about going back to doing things like that, you have to question perhaps the sanity of people who want to go back to a time when we were doing things that got us into the financial crisis that we're still trying to get out of. Well, African Americans are not against the ideology of conservatism. If you were to judge the African American community by the institutions that it has, where for the black community it would be primarily the black church, which tend to be conservative. The issue is not conservatism. It's been the characters who profess conservatism. So when you look at certain people and how they seem to react towards people of color, you take the 2012 Republican primary and you look at the statements of people like Rick Santorum or Newt Gingrich, look at the actions of people like Donald Trump, and they claim to be conservative. It's not the ideology that's being rejected, it's the people who profess this ideology. The idea that, for example, you can say as a Republican candidate that I will not make black people's lives better by giving them other people's money, or tell black people to march for jobs, not for food stamps. These kind of statements are not going to endear a community to a person who professes to be a conservative. Now, people have talked about, well, what about black conservatism? As I've said before, the black community, as judged by its institutions, does not really have a problem with conservatives. The problem with many black conservatives is that they tend to talk about black people more than they talk to black people. And so in that case, I think even the comments of a Herman Cain saying that 2/3 of black people are brainwashed. Here was a guy who could have opened up a bridge between the Republican Party and the African American community, which has voted in large numbers for Republicans in the past, such as President Dwight D. Eisenhower and also President Richard Nixon. But what his campaign became was comic relief. And so it did not really create a serious attempt to say, let's look at a party who may have different ideas, but let's at least consider them. If you think about, for example, the Republican Party has this so-called outreach to the black community, and they're doing it by virtue of their website. When Michael Steele was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, one of the things he suggested was for the Republican Party to go into areas where black people live. And that was rejected. And so you have to ask the question, well, if you want to have an outreach, a serious outreach to communities of color, but you're not willing to hold your events there, then how serious should the black community take your so-called attempts? Well, the issue of marriage equality, quite naturally, is a controversial issue. Whether you think about it as an issue of fairness or whatever, it is controversial. Having said that, one of the issues I think we have to understand is that the president is correct when he talks about this being a civil issue and also an issue of the state. If we argue this issue from a religious perspective, we must understand that the church in of itself does not marry anybody. Whether you're a priest or a rabbi or imam, you perform a marriage ceremony on behalf of the state. And so from its very inception, in the way that it's set up, it is a state issue. It is an issue of civil rights as opposed to religious rights. So the question is, what shall we consider this? Obviously, I do believe that the church should have the right to determine who they are going to perform the rite of marriage for. But it is a civil right. The United States has to understand, and I think when you see religious leaders claim the United States to be a Christian nation, they're wrong. And they're wrong by virtue of being misinformed, or perhaps they're purposely telling people this. But the United States is not a Christian nation. The United States is a secular nation that has the greatest religious freedom of any nation in the world. And it has a large segment of its population who are themselves religious. But this is not a religious issue, and it has never been set up as a religious issue. If the pastor is not registered with the state, the marriage is invalid. It doesn't matter what they say. What the church does is it blesses a union. But it cannot marry anyone without the authorization of the state. So the president is correct from that perspective. Religious beliefs in this particular instance must be respected in terms of who they will perform a marriage rite for. But I think there are two different things: the issue of religiosity and the issue of civil rights. In this case, I believe that the issue of civil rights must win out. What has troubled me is this notion of anointing people as job creators. I think that's dangerous because what is happening there is that you're trying to deem one segment of the population as more valuable than another. The truth of the matter is, it is the middle class and the working class that creates wealth. Because you can invest in something, but if the middle class, the working class, and others do not buy into the product that you have invested in, that will wind up being a bad investment. So in actuality, given what our economy is, a consumer-driven economy, yes, there are transfer payments out of social services and a social safety net, but our economy is by and large a consumer-based economy. So if the middle class is not able to buy, if working people are not able to buy, the economy suffers. And so this anointing of the wealthy as the job creators, or as the speaker says, we can't hurt the job creators. Well, you are. When you do not make policies and implement policies that create the consumer class to buy, you are hurting the job creators, which is the middle class and the working class. The idea of that somehow the folks who are at the top of the economic ladder are the job creators in of themselves is a fallacy that people in the United States must simply reject and dismiss.